Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Let me welcome you on the last panel of today, which is called Soft Power Revisited, Alternative Facts for Post-Truth Reality. All of these panelists next to me, they have excellent CVs, and if I want to go through them, we would be here the whole evening, so I'm just gonna cover the basic thing. So it's my great honor to introduce Mr. Ambassador Cameron Munter, who is the president of EastWest Institute in New York, and he served as a US Foreign Service officer for nearly 3 decades. Next to him, it's Dr. Valbona Zeneli. She is the professor of security studies and director of the Black Sea Eurasia program at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. Next to the great, beautiful lady, it's the Ambassador Gérard Stoudmann, and his career includes work at Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Economy, and he has lots of experience in election management and observation, as well as in mediation and human rights monitoring. Next to him, there is a Dr. Dejan Jović, a professor of international relations at the University of Zagreb, also visiting professor at the University of Belgrade and visiting research fellow on the University of London. And last but not least, we do have Mr. Balázs Jarábik, a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing research on East and Central Europe with particular focus on Ukraine. So let me remind you the name of the panel. It's the Soft Power Revisited, Alternative Facts for a Post-Truth Reality. So what we will talk about now, actually, is the term post-factual era or post-factual reality. And that this term was firstly used or coined in 2004. And since then, it's been used more and more in describing the trends in political campaigning or argumentation of political actors. And it seems that we are now more in the era when the fact-based argumentation or the truth is not more essential for the argumentation, and instead the attention to the intuition or the people's emotion plays the role instead. So basically the aim of our panel is basically to uncover the fields in which the post-truth era is visible most. And also we might ask the question, shall we or how can we efficiently fight post-factual trends in political campaigning, or shall we do that? Do we have the right to do that? And so I'd like to firstly start with some kind of like a basic panel maybe question. Are fake news something new, or did we not have it? Did we not have it before? And because we do have a woman on this panel, I'm going to relate this question to Valbona. So Valbona, please, could you answer this question?
It's great to be back here in Belgrade. I've been lucky and honored to be part of so many Belgrade security forums. It's a great venue. It's one of the best conferences, I'll say, in the region of Southeast Europe. In preparing for this panel, although my background is in economics, so I'll try to do my best, I was looking at what does post-truth mean. And I could find a definition at the Oxford Dictionary, which is the denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So this is the definition of post-truth. But personally, I don't think, I don't buy this term. I think it's a buzzword. There's not such a thing like true or not true. It's either true or not true. And I don't think truth can change color also after the fact. So I think it's one of those buzzwords. In Europe now we hear the word resilience, which could be also one of the counter arguments in fighting post-truth or alternative facts. But what we see nowadays is a fascination, and I'll say a gamesmanship of manipulations of facts and data. So alternative facts, those are actually tactics that do not add anything to the social discourse, but they have happened even before. It's just in a smaller scale, in much smaller environments. Today we are much more interconnected, and this is why we feel it much more. So on one side we have the proliferation of the social media, and on the other side we have a commercialization of the mainstream media, which has become more of a business. So I'll say that a handful of media groups nowadays dominate the world media. And I would like to really stress this importance of understanding the pervasiveness of social media into all aspects of the society, but also the number of communication channels that can be exploited or used to mislead people. So today, I think news is really commercially incentivized. The objective is increasingly less educating people and more about aligning topic coverage to meet commercial advertising markets. For example, Paris Hilton versus food shortage in Africa, or a Hollywood scandal versus articulating a complex geopolitical issue. So I think really the objective of educating people is of diminished relevance. And news also cycles are shorter and shorter today. So from 12 hours to an hour to 30 minutes to a continual state of really breaking news. And in this context, nowadays, it's much easier to buy in and to spread fake news than real news. Because legitimacy of the news has quality control measures, which add to the time of spreading the news, while you can really spread fake news in minutes, and then you need much more time to respond to that with the real facts. And also, on the other side, I think fake news create audiences that believe that are informed, but they are sadly very misinformed. People today are working more, have more time or less time to sit down and read the newspapers, and even are suspicious, even if they are suspicious of the news, they don't have the time to do the research. So they're happy with the sound bites. And this is what media outlets and politicians have picked up on. So just giving sound bites to people that they can buy it. So they have recognized the importance of fake news and sound bites, and they're just using it for their political purposes. So, but the basis, it was discussed throughout the conference yesterday and also today, I think it's the skeptical citizenry that we're seeing in the Western countries, both in the United States and also in the European Union, which are frustrated with elites for their inability to come up with workable solutions to the problems. And the problems were already mentioned: inequality, slow growth. I think this is one of the biggest problems. For the last, I would say, 20 years, Western European countries have not seen high rate growth rates, and this is not translated into well-being and standards of living for the citizens. Then deindustrialization in the United States or immigration issues. So mainly it has always existed. It's just that now, the media outlets and social media and the mainstream media is using it much more.
Okay, thank you. So it has always existed. It's always been here with us. And it's just the faster thing, right? The faster world. Maybe, Gérard, could you comment on it? Where do you think is it most visible now, currently?
Thank you. Well, I think I agree very much. It's a buzzword, and it's very fashionable now to speak about new concept and new paradigm. I question whether there is any new paradigm. I think the changing political environment, certainly, populism, certainly, but it's nothing new. I fully agree. Just look at history. If you read about this post-truth politic or post-truth reality, you get the feeling that it is something that is tagged since 2016 with the US elections and with the Brexit. But actually, it happened. You can find example in the 14th century if you look at all the case made against the Order of the Temple, which was a total disinformation with the means of the 14th century. But you can go throughout its history, you will find fake news, intoxication, manipulation of the public opinion all the time. Look at the 1930s and the regime there in Germany and in Italy. And look more recently at what happened in 2002-2003 before the Iraq invasion, and the case that was made about weapons of mass destruction with big means, completely misinterpretation of facts and intoxication of the public opinion by the then British Prime Minister and by the US administration. So there's nothing new. What is new then? What is new is the technology. And the technology at a time of spreading populism. And I think the combination of new technology and populism is what is new. And what is new is that it also very much happens in more and more in democracies which are supposed to rest on facts, which are supposed to have electoral cycles where the competitors present programs. No, they present less and less programs, they do more and more politics and less of policy. And if you look at, for instance, the last presidential French elections and some of the statements that were made there, and if you compare it to, for instance, the French presidential election in '81 between Giscard d'Estaing and Mitterrand, there was a big discussion about the program there, the socialist program, privatization of bank, etc., etc. Now, everybody speaks about program in the 2017 French presidential election, but nobody has really presented a concrete program, even the winner. Just buzzwords, just, you know, some sound bites and some catchwords. And the example is when in the debate, Mrs. Le Pen was asked, why do you want to leave the euro? Oh, because I want to increase the buying power of the French population. Most of the sound bites, most of the declaration that politicians allow themselves to do today in a campaign is not based on fact and don't resist any analysis. So it happens in democracies that are in the defensive very much on some of their fundamental values. It is also happening at a time where you have, I think, a serious decrease in political ethics. I don't think there's been, at any time in world history, political ethics as a number one value, but more and more politicians allow themselves things that would not have been possible before. And they get away with it, which leads us to another factor, is the acceptance by the public opinion of a pattern of lies, of stories that they are told, maybe because there's a lot of uncertainty, maybe because there are dire economic conditions, and people, especially the middle class, sees its situation worsening, and there's fear, migration, and all the things that we read every day. Maybe all these factors put together leads people to want people to come with easy answers. And, you know, don't worry, I will fix it, I will build a wall, and the wall will fix it. But that's something that is not serious. But you allow yourself to say it in a serious campaign in one of the biggest Western countries and biggest Western democracy. In France, the same kind of thing. And in most campaign, not everywhere, but in most campaign, you have more and more of this alternative fact, or this, at best, relativation of the truth. When it's not fake news, when it's not direct intoxication, it's at least manipulation of the truth to make things more simple to understand. And at the end of the day, the one who wins seems to be the one who is the better at lying. So in this, why is it happening? Why we have populism, that's a wider debate. But I think the issue of post-truth is artificial. It has always existed. I fully agree. It has always existed. It will always exist. It is just adapting to new means. Just think what Mr. Goebbels would have done if he had the technology that we have today in the 1930s, or Mussolini. Would have been fantastic. So that's it.
Okay. For time. Thank you, Gérard. Maybe, Jovan, you can link to this. Sorry, Dejan. Could we take it also as a challenge or only as a threat? Or what is the political interest behind the fake news? Can you link to this?
Yeah, I think, first of all, the character of politics is, I wouldn't say has changed, but it's certainly developing in a different direction. I think we live now in a much more constructivist environment in which identities and perceptions matter. We live in the time of politics which is becoming a spectacle, where, for example, people who appear on TV programs are highly popular, therefore qualify for winning elections. I mean, we have at least, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump and so on. People who actually secured their popularity with direct access to the general population via TV. So they use the media actually to build up their political careers and political chances. But this is a result, I think, of the crisis of not only liberalism, I think, but also enlightenment in general. I think we live in a world in which it is really difficult to say that people make decisions based on rationality, on rational thinking. They vote based on the line that they construct themselves in their own imagination about who is ours and who is theirs. So that line that divides the world into people who will represent me better because they are one of us. They belong to this collective us. And those others who are actually the other, and whatever they say, whatever argument they put, whatever rationality they present, we are, I think, unlikely to change our own position, because our position is no longer based on rationality, but it is based on identities. And now, should we blame anyone for that? I don't think so. I mean, it's just a different type of politics. It is never, in democracy, it is never meant to be the case that people should qualify to vote. They are not asked, they have never been asked to explain why they vote the way they vote. It's been a long time ago when we actually abolished any threshold in terms of education in order to allow people to vote. Everyone has one vote, equal vote, irrespective of their education or their ability to detach themselves from their own personal identity, if this is ever possible at all. So I think we need to accept in this, I would say, post-liberal world, that it's not only rationality that constitutes a voter and a person and a political space, and that politics is not only about rational debate. I think we were for a very long time believers in this enlightenment concept, which is close to my heart as well. I mean, and I'm quite sorry that this is happening, actually, that we are now in a post-liberal, I would say, world, in which it is not about the argument, in which it is about other elements, such as, for example, identity. Now, whether it represents a threat or not, I think it is easier to manipulate with identities and emotions, with the process of constructing the otherness as an enemy, or not only as a neighbor, but rather as a hostile neighbor, the other as hostile other. And especially if we have professionals who are in charge of this process. So it's no longer political amateurs that are trying to mobilize their own support for themselves, but it's also professionals who are now actually selling that kind of politics like a good. We live in a world in which politics is no longer about argument, but it is about selling and buying, but largely selling my product. Yeah? And we see this in the United States of America. I think it's been for a long time, really, an area in which politics is about how much money you have and how much access to media you have and how much actually time you can buy, and actually not about rationality in the first place. And I think really where it becomes dangerous is in this process of constructing the other as an enemy. And I think the best example, really, and I'm glad you have already mentioned this, is this idea of Iraq having ability to having weapons of mass destruction. I mean, that was a clear attempt to construct the otherness, to justify actions of us and to mobilize us based on fear against the others. I lived in a country which has gone through a huge conflict in the 1990s. And this conflict has been actually, it started with this production of fears and of turning the neighbors into hostile other, into an enemy. And this is continuing. It's continuing in interpretations of the war, interpretations of the conflict, and so on and so forth. So I think this is the situation. It's a global. I think it needs to be linked with the crisis of liberalism. You know, liberalism became, even in Europe, liberalism in the last 10 years became a dirty word. You know, a financial crisis endangered it. The crisis of ideology endangered it. It becomes, from the left and from the right, it actually becomes suspicious if you say that you're actually liberal, that you believe in rationality, that enlightenment, for example, is or should be the basis of politics. Instead of that, what we actually have are debates all over the place about the threats and the otherness and how to constitute ourselves in opposition to the others. For example, Euroscepticism, that debate on a vertical level between the nation state as us and Europe as the other, but also internally, you know, debates within politics, for example, in Hungary, I mean, where you have illiberal, what we call illiberal democracy, which is full of this production of fears, whether from, I don't know, banks or from Europe or from communists or whatever, Poland, for example, as well. Yeah. So I think we see a new character of politics, maybe post-liberal, maybe post-enlightenment, and much more constructivist.
Thank you. Maybe Cameron Munter, could you comment on it? I mean, in relation to the U.S. presidential elections. I mean, we have heard a lot about it. So, can you relate to it, please?
Certainly, I'm happy to do that. And since I usually, as a diplomat, was mixing in the internal affairs of other countries, this is my opportunity to mix in the affairs of the United States. So, my Serbian friends will be glad to hear that that I'm finally finished with the internal affairs here. Actually, all I can really offer are grace notes or elaborations on, I think, the main points that have been made by the others. The idea that we have technical changes, which have changed the way things have worked, that are reflected in the social and economic changes. Not that we can say categorically some specific nameless globalism hits the United States and causes a cultural change. There's a lot of back and forth. And I would avoid monocausality. But what we've seen in the United States that's manifested itself in what I guess you would call the Trump phenomenon are illustrations of trends that have come up in the recent years, such as the change in social structure in the United States, that the political class no longer has either the authority to mediate to people. We always had weak political parties compared to European political parties. Ours were really just campaign organizations. But as the repository of program, as we were talking, the legitimacy of a party to represent that has been basically worn down, or has disappeared. In that sense, the legitimacy of political elites has become less. So the authenticity, the authority, and the legitimacy, all of these kind of buzzwords, which I think, again, my colleagues have all mentioned, they've all been worn down because of changes in the international economy, which have meant that the means by which people become wealthy and the distribution of wealth works has made certain groups doubt and certain groups be seen as cynical. And in addition, the social media or the broader changes in the media, the mediating function of media, have changed so that, as was mentioned before, someone who was on television as a reality TV star, instead of being an object of curiosity, became, in his own way, legitimate. And those who would look at Trump and would argue that he is a dope or a madman or a fool are kidding themselves. This is a very savvy individual who is very good at the manipulation of these modern media elements to represent a kind of politics where he recognizes the otherness as a tool, so that he not only can reach directly to people, he doesn't have to go through media, and he's able to do that through social media, but he's also able to have policies that don't need to be policies for all Americans. America, which at least in its own mythology believes that it's a country of diversity, a country where many different kinds of people come together. If you use the example of his foreign policy, he will talk about a Muslim ban, or he will talk about a wall with Mexico, or he'll talk about tariffs in China. It has nothing to do with China, it has nothing to do with Mexico, and it has nothing to do with Muslims. It has to do with West Virginia. It has to do with an electorate that he can shore up using very wisely these tools that have been described for the purpose not so much of policy, because he's really not going to bring back coal mining jobs to West Virginia. And he has no intention of doing that, but he is going to stay in power. So you heard it here first. My prediction, Trump, 8 years. Because he understands that he is trying to work on power rather than on a political policy direction. The Republicans and the Democrats go crazy over Trump because he's not consistent on policy, but he's very consistent on the use of shoring up constituencies in domestic power. And this is the challenge, again, that we have to the liberal consensus that we in the United States like to think we were part of. We were one of the last countries with an Enlightenment constitution from the 18th century. That constitution assumed not only that you tell people how the Constitution defines for people how they act, but that there was a certain attitude towards, say, the office of the presidency. That if you talk about sexual assault and you're proud of it, that somehow that disqualifies you. It's an act. Or if you talk about that you are scornful of people who are different than your constituency, that somehow that would disqualify you. And that's no longer the case. It's clear that what's happened, the combination of sociological change that has changed the beliefs of the electorate and their receptivity to this kind of work, and the cleverness of a man like Trump who can articulate that, means that traditional legitimacy is at least under fire. And the kind of legitimacy that Trump has with his constituency is not the constituency based on I agree with what he will do, but that my emotional sense, I think you talked about that definition of emotion versus rationality, my emotional sense is he's going to do what I want to do. Don't confuse me with the facts. So once again, my intervention here is only basically to underscore what each of the other people have said, using the American example, which, because it's big, it tends to be overwhelming. As Americans always say, anything worth doing is worth overdoing, right? And that's what we've done. We are probably now on the forefront of this situation within politics where this fake news truth or questions about truth are being tested in a laboratory. And for those of us who share the liberal background, it's a difficult thing to watch.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Balázs, you can put us back to Europe, and can you give us some kind of background to Central or Eastern Europe?
Sure, I will try. And I'm actually also want to thanks for inviting me to Belgrade. I have been focusing on Eastern Europe in the past 10 years. But I was working in Yugoslavia. At that time it was Yugoslavia, back in the late 90s under Milosevic. I was also duly arrested before the elections in Čačak, so I have a good connection to Serbia, and I'm always very happy to return. I also I'm a bit in an unusual place because people usually invited me to actually give alternative opinions or challenging opinions, and I'm in a very bad position now, because I can't really challenge. These points are very much, these points are very much mine. So let me actually, I certainly think that the post-truth is a reaction on the elite reaction and the media reaction on something what they see as a losing game, and shifting responsibility toward outside and not taking responsibility, therefore not willing to learn a lesson and make the changes. I think that democracy is very much alive and kicking. And liberalism too. The problem is the neoliberalism, what we actually inherently, both in the economy and the political side, we're actually talking about. I, as a liberal, have problem with those people who are protecting liberal democracy by labeling anyone else with a different opinion as Russian agent, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So a few points on why I think it's happening structurally, or let's put it like that, the political economy of this phenomenon. First, point number one, trust in the society is dissipating. When you look at the polls and you see that the United States, the trust in the United States authorities, let's say the Congress and the Senate, is 11%, and exactly the same 11% what you have a trust in Ukraine and in their own parliament, then you can say, wait a minute, what's going on, right? And this is not only United States for Ukraine, I think it's across the board, what we have been saying. Point number two, the social contract between government and citizens are very much shaken. Point number three, there is an erosion of traditional institutions. It was mentioned the media for example, you know, like there is no longer the vetting process or no longer the filtering of what actually people are going to read. There's much more freedom, and much more freedom is also leading sometimes to anarchy instead of, you know, process. Point number 4, which this conference already dealt with, is inequality. Is the economic inequality, which is directly stemming from neoliberal policies of the first 30 years. And talking about, you know, soft power, you know, I was growing up in a communist country, in a communist Czechoslovakia, with the notion, and later on, with the notion that the state is bad and the markets are good, right? The market's always gonna have a solution for you. And, you know, there's generations in my countries in Central and Eastern Europe which are still believing this. But is this really the case? Or is it really the truth? Well, since at least 2008, when the markets are on, state infusion, meaning governments, the United States and the European Union is printing money, certainly should be shaken our beliefs. Point number 5, the political polarization. The division of the societies in the West is what make them look like the East or Eastern Europe, which I'm dealing with. And I'm certainly not claiming any expertise on Western Europe, but the symptoms are simply so similar because the patterns are similar. And one of these patterns, which the neoliberal policies were bringing, is the economic monopolization. There are monopolies, you know, remember the too big to fail before 2008? Well, after the policies were creating even bigger to fail, and now we have the same kind of problems we're facing. And number 6, and the last point, is the insecurity within these societies. And the insecurity I would frame in a questions like, whose interest our political class is representing? Who am I going to vote? Who am I going to vote to who actually represent my interest, right? And the dissatisfaction connected to this, which is, I think we can, you know, was Brexit a good decision? Not really, but people expressing dissatisfaction by that. Was Donald Trump a good choice for president? Well, hell no. But, you know, I don't think that the people who voted for Donald Trump wanted him necessarily as a president, but they wanted to express its dissatisfaction with the entire political class. What we are seeing, unfortunately, that the political class is reacting in this kind of phenomenon, like, oh, the post-truth world, you know, the Russian hacked the elections, and all kind of other external factors, but their own responsibility. I'm going to stop here. I do think, and in the second round, maybe we can talk about the soft power. Despite all what I said, I think particularly the European Union have enormous soft power left. We're sitting here in Belgrade, right? And we're still talking about the European integration for the whole region, for the Western Balkans, which is, by the way, not happening really. And why it's not happening? Well, because the EU has big structural problems. And we don't really talk about that. And unless the EU is going to solve it, unfortunately, this region is, when it comes to the integration, doomed. But, you know, I remember the 90s and I remember the Radical Party. Is that the Radical Party in 15 years later is going to be the pro-European party? I wouldn't even dream of. And that is certainly an impact of soft power. The issue is what we're going to do with the soft power if the structural institutions and the structures, the mechanisms, which we use this soft power as a projection to achieve something are no longer working or no longer there. And therefore, I think we have to kind of look a little bit back and do those reforms, you can call it reforms, or address those imbalances within our societies before it comes too late. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Cameron, please.
I want to just underscore that link that you made, cleverly bringing us back not only to the media and the news and the ideas in post-truth, but back to soft power. So that after we've given the gloomy version at the beginning, the more moderate, or at least the brighter notion, is that in fact those elements in a situation like this that are steady and are sometimes still linked to traditional notions of decency, liberal tolerance, etc., do tend to be those elements in the more developed states of Western Europe and the United States that have civil society, those institutions like bureaucracies, those institutions like universities, like nonprofits, and even like organizations that promote business ethics. And in a way, with all due respect to those of us who've worked in the diplomatic world, you know that old phrase about wars too important to be left to the generals. Well, it's certainly true that in international affairs, diplomacy is too important to be left to the diplomats. And in fact, The diplomats are important parts. Government representatives are important parts of international relations, but all of those other institutions I mentioned are playing an enormous role. And that role, despite what we all, I think, accurately identify as the crises of legitimacy and authenticity and others of governance, they're balanced in a sense by the depth in varying degrees in varying countries of those other institutions that fill in the gap. So I was aware when I was speaking that I was coming across like somewhat of a Cassandra, and I'm actually not. I think that there is in Europe and in the United States an enormous, tell me the word, resiliency, the buzzword resiliency, but that resiliency is in, however you choose to call it, civil society, and that soft power, that way of getting around the sharper edges of what I would call the distortions of politics work is room for hope.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maybe Valbona, you can add something to this from the Balkan perspective.
Well, about the Western Balkans perspective, I think the Western Balkans, there's not such a thing as post-truth, because I think politicians here have been ignoring the truth for a very long time and in every aspect of society. And we mentioned, some of the tools of, alternative facts and all that, and that are bringing a democratic backsliding in many countries. And I think one of those tools is media. Media in the Western Balkans is much less developed than the other countries that even were brought as examples here today. Much more politically and economically controlled. And I would say that there is a worsening in terms of the media position in the Western Balkans since the economic crisis. So after the economic crisis in Europe, there was also, when it comes to the external support to media outlets, but also, so independent free media outlets, but also to civil society, this has scaled down after the crisis of 2008, 2009. And in the Western Balkans, media and politicians, because politicians are a very crucial part of media messaging in the Western Balkans, they're telling people what they want them to think, no, not how to think. And I think they're trying to control the thinking process, and there is one objective behind that, which is distraction from the everyday issues that people have, which are poverty, unemployment, and corruption, high levels of corruption. If you ask people here in the region, there were even some data that came out few days ago from the Western Balkans Barometer. The main security challenges for people are not the ethnic issues or the disputes in the region. It's their everyday life. It's poverty and it's unemployment. So politicians are not tackling those issues and are trying to distract the public attention towards other ideas. And I think what is happening right now, it's so much danger in the region that does not have a real democracy in place. Even if you look at different surveys, different data, you'll see that most of the countries of the Western Balkans are still, after 25 years of transition, hybrid regimes. So even in this case, we're seeing a democratic backsliding, even going to elections. I mean, even elections, I think are becoming more, let's say, we're seeing strategic manipulation of elections, not on the elections day, but through the media, buying campaigns and control. So I think this is very, very crucial to be addressed in a region that concerns so many, security challenges. And I don't know, maybe later we can address the soft power and how to move the situation in the Western Balkans.
Okay, so the question then is, how should we deal with it, or shall we deal with it, or maybe I've seen Dejan that you've probably disagreed, so maybe we want to add something.
No. Not that much disagree, but I would go back to this, what I said earlier, and that is this constructivist approach, of images and perceptions. You rightly mentioned, we here believe in Europe and the whole conflict. Well, believing is not a rational thing, is it? Believing is an emotion that's been constructed by somebody. And first of all, is a question of whether we believe in it or not. Because if you look public opinion, for example, or even the results of the referendum in the last country that joined the European Union, this is Croatia, it's actually only 28% of the people that voted for the EU. 58% didn't vote. They were EU indifferent completely. And then 14% voted against it. Is it really true that people believe in European Union. Also, there are many who don't believe in the European Union. You can't actually convince them in any rational discussion, or very few you can do about that the European Union will help in their life, or will address poverty, or will address inequality, or will develop these areas. And actually, if you look rational data, there are many good reasons why they are skeptical. Yeah, we can't just, and we ignore, I mean, the political elite is ignoring, political elites in these countries in the Balkans largely ignore facts and occurrences, things in politics that do not fit into their image. If they argue 20 years European Union is good for you, they just don't engage in addressing issues such as, for example, why then is one of the products of joining the European Union for East European countries losing 26 million people? That's how many people actually have moved from this country somewhere else in this process. So how can this be good for us, after all? Yeah? And also linked with the issue of sovereignty. Yeah? So what does it actually mean if you argued that you need independence from Yugoslavia because you wanted always to be independent? How can you reconcile this with the idea that you need to join the EU, in which you will actually now move from one multi-ethnic construction into another? So I think there is a lack of rational debate and the belief in rationality. Instead of that, I think we're creating images, positive or negative. And I think this is also happening in domestic politics. Here you mentioned quite rightly poverty and unemployment. Well, in reality, people who are most responsible for poverty and unemployment are entrepreneurs, this business elite. And for inequality in particular, I mean, if you look data, you will see actually how big is the gap, and it's a growing gap between the income of CEOs and of those people who are actually unemployed or are employed part-time. Nevertheless, there is an image being created by these guys who are in control of the media and so on and so forth, of the real power behind the throne, that it's politicians who are actually responsible for inequality and unemployment. And so people, for example, vote, and then even when they elect somebody, nothing happens out of that. Nothing happens because they have occupied empty space of power. The real power is somewhere else. The real power is behind the area of politics. And actually, these guys who are actually in charge and really powerful, we never get to elect them. And we idealize them as big, successful entrepreneurs without actually ever asking a question of their responsibility for social situation of inequality and poverty in a society. So I think even when we vote, we see that nothing happens, therefore we get disappointed. And in addition to that, there is this image being created in our contemporary society that everything that is linked with public is bad. Yeah? So we will, everything, whoever gets involved in politics is actually parasiting, yeah, on money created by entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs is good and public affairs is bad. That is the image we actually have within this society. And now we even expect that some business people like Donald Trump will save us. They will save us. We never ask the question, of, for example, for example, in Croatia, we brought a prime minister who is from business. He lasted 10 months or something like that. But he was treated as a savior because he's good. He's in real business. I think this is very strongly really linked with the images being produced in which politics is, we expect too much from politics for what politics actually can provide in where it matters, and that's the conditions of our everyday life. And at the same time, we are also under a heavy influence of this negative image of politicians and getting involved in politics. So to conclude, I think our position is paradoxical. We tweet and we think we participate. We vote and we think we participate. And actually, neither by tweeting nor by voting, we can change anything, in fact. Even when we actually occupy the space of politics, we still get disappointed because we are not addressing the real place of power, which is for us invisible. It's largely invisible. It's somewhere else. We never demonstrate in front of a corporation, right? We never think, those people who are really powerful, we never demonstrate in front of the media houses. We demonstrate in front of parliament. But the parliament, unfortunately, is rather powerless compared to the sources of real power.
Yeah, Valbona, you
Yeah,
wanted to
if
comment?
I may, I mean, Dejan, I agree with many of your points, but I slightly disagree with the role, of the government. I mean, talking about the Western Balkans, but many other Eastern European countries, you have an environment when the government and the economic interests are so closely interlinked, and kind of rent-seeking economies where, somehow politicians also are responsible for the monopolies that are created in the market. So I'll say this is why, they are responsible for creating the fair rules of game and the level playing field for businesses. And I think this is the issue, at least in the Western Balkans. And also regarding elections, I think people have lost trust, and you brought data, people do not trust any more political parties. I know for sure in Albania, but in many other countries in the region, people vote based on the prisoner's dilemma. So let's vote who does less harm to the country. And I don't think, elections are how they ought to be about the future promise. It's more about the present. So this is, I think, one of the biggest, or the past. So I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing. But I think governments should be kept responsible for the climate, for the business climate that exists in the country.
Okay, thank you. Balázs, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to actually address a little bit the belief versus facts, right? And because this is also capturing I think it's a key thing to understand that the people, why the fact-checking and all this, why the facts, which we believe should run policies and should run, should be decisive when it comes to campaigning or not, because simply people want to believe. We are human beings and we want to believe. That's why, the first real institution was the church. And I'm sometimes joking with my students that if you guys want to believe, go to the church, but don't go to politics. In politics, you should check, right? And Ronald Reagan famous trust but verify, which is actually based on a Russian proverb, "Доверяй, не проверяй," is can be used very much. But fundamentally, people actually want to believe, and they don't believe, once again, that their elected representatives are actually representing their interest, the public interest. They're representing something else. And, I barely mentioned Ukraine, which is my main focus in the past 5-8 years. But, it's a very interesting process is what's going on in Ukraine, because if you would sum up what the Ukrainians are trying to do and what the EU is trying to help the Ukrainians to reform the country, you would get to depoliticize state institutions, meaning separation of power, right? Regulating the markets, going against the oligarchs and monopoles, breaking them down, focus on the social contract, meaning, what actually the public interest, citizens is, decentralization. Or judiciary, which is, the Ukrainians just essentially elected the Supreme Court of 25 judges from the scratch over open competition with a verification, a very strict verification process by a public integrity council and a state judiciary council as well. So it's a kind of two phases. You know why this is interesting? This is Kaczynski's wet dream in Poland, which the EU is against completely. There was no such a thing in Slovakia. There was no such a thing in Hungary or Poland. So anyway, so I think it's kind of, these kind of things, separation of power is particularly interesting, what we see how the institutions are struggling with Trump. Right? Also, there is a clear separation of power and why that matters and why that is important. Second point, very quickly, the middle class. And I forgot to mention, I think it's the key consequence of all these economic policies was the eroding middle class, and there is nothing in the middle, or very little left in the middle. It's the middle class which is causing so much trouble, right? Simply because it's the middle class which suffered the most. Don't forget that we still have austerity in the European Union officially, right? We're not taxing, the multinationals that much. I mean, the EU is moving toward it, but we actually providing austerity for the middle class. Furthermore, how fragile is that as an answer for something which is not the problem? Anyway, and mentioning Hungary and Poland, the Hungarian and the Polish government are both cases, Fidesz, Orbán and Kaczynski, are popular, which you cannot really find in the Western media, because they're focusing on the middle class. And to the regions, because the urban-rural divide is also something very important. And similarly, by the way, to Putin in Russia and Lukashenko in Belarus, they actually do care, and they enacting policies which are trying to help the middle class. The Polish government now is the first government in the past 10, 12 years which was increasing, social payments, particularly, focusing on the rural area. You know how we're calling this? Populism. And I think it's fundamentally wrong. It's the bad label that we're calling it populism. We're actually trying to help with that labor, which is causing the most trouble in politics, and they have the political benefit out of it. These are the layers which are supporting them against vis-a-vis the EU. And here comes the big problem, or a big difference and misunderstanding between Poland and Hungary, is like, how come 70% of these, the most pro-EU populations are Hungary and Poland? And whatever the EU does against these governments are not popular. Well, that's why. Because the locals are not seeing what the EU says about their government. They're seeing their government, they're judging the government based on their local experience.
Okay, thank you. I think it always seems that we always end up with populism, us and them, black and white, yes or no, with this kind of dichotomy from the post-truth reality and the fake news. But Gérard, you wanted to comment on something?
Thank you. I want to come back on what Dejan said about the government versus economy and where the real power sits. I think what you are saying would fit very well in some countries like mine, Switzerland, for instance. We know that the power is not really with the government, and we know where it is. I'm not sure it fits everywhere. I'm sure there are cases which are more complex and where the government does have possibilities and an impact. But I think the real question is that we are confronted with is the lack of credibility or the loss of credibility of the traditional elite, of the traditional political parties. And no matter how hard they try, it seems that there is a downward spiral for them, and that there is a wish from the electorates in so many countries to see something new coming. What is new is, of course, very much tinted with populism. We have to ask, why is populism so successful? I think there are many reasons that we can also take in history. But the fact is that the traditional elite can come with good ideas, they can come with a program if they are trying to, but they are very much discredited. They are very much discredited. Nobody believes in them, and people want to try something else. They want to have people who will maybe lie, and I guess part of the electorate will accept that they are lying. But they are saying the others are lying as well, so what's the difference? At least these ones are new, and they're coming with new solutions. So I don't care. This is why maybe we have more acceptance about certain things that are, in a way, shocking and very, very blatant lies and manipulation of the truth. And the public opinion doesn't react as one would have expected. It's because they have digested the fact that they don't trust and they don't believe any politicians anymore. So they're just going to look at who is coming with new solutions. As you say, it may be Trump because he comes from the business, so he may be lying, he may be having an... how many interviews do you hear with average US citizens who say, yes, I don't like everything with Trump, I don't like his behavior toward women, etc. But nevertheless. So I think that's the core issue we are faced with. We are going into something new which is acceptable by most electorates and which doesn't look very nice all the time.
Okay, thank you. It gives me back to the question. I mean, shall we fight with the fake news? And how shall we fight, if we shall? And who should be the arbiter of truth? Maybe anyone who wants to answer this question?
Well,
Mr. Munter, maybe?
I'm not going to say who gets to be the arbiter of truth. I'll pass that on. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's the key here is to hold the bad actors accountable and to increase transparency. Currently, there are no consequences for lying and for bad actions. And well, if you shout, for example, in a movie theater, fire, you get punished. You get charged because you endanger to the public. Well, the fact that the media might lie, might transform facts, they don't get any consequences. So I think accountability, it's a key word here.
Accountability of the politicians, because I come from a country, I'm a citizen of a country where a president of the country is misusing the information and misleading the facts and completely using this kind of, let's say, fake news, right? So that's why I'm asking about, like, how shall we deal with it? How shall we do with the media, with the social media, with the politicians, accountability of the politicians? How? I mean, is there a way out of it? Or shall we not fight with it? Because, I mean, yeah.
I think at least in politics, we know how. Yeah. We do have a chance every 4 years, in some countries, even in shorter periods, to vote for somebody else and maybe to put ourselves as candidates. Nevertheless, as I said, we mentioned earlier this big case of fake news about Iraq. I mean, after that, Tony Blair was re-elected. It didn't matter all that much. So the real question, and it was quite obvious that this was a fake and deliberately produced in order to securitize, in order to mobilize, in order to start a war, a fake news. Yeah? Now the question is why we don't do that. And I know, in this part of the world, I mean, if you look, for example, public opinion polls every month, you would find countries where 70% of the people would say our country is going in the wrong direction. And we dislike politicians, we don't trust them, something like that. Nevertheless, they keep voting for them. They keep voting for the same parties. And they nevertheless, all the time, talk they're unhappy with them. So I think we are here in a kind of a situation in which is a paradox, isn't it? How can you actually do that? I mean, it's an easy way. I mean, you can't do anything about business elite. Yeah? You can't do anything about bankers or banking elite. Yeah? I mean, you can't do anything against media moguls, can you? You can't do anything about them. And their political influence, for example, in Britain, yeah? Even if they are foreign citizens, they are owners of the main media, is huge, and everyone knows it's huge. Nothing you can do about that. Nothing you can do about that. But here you can, and you don't actually use. And this brings me to another paradox or a question that I put forward, and that is, we elect politicians and then we dislike them immediately, right? But we elect them and then we dislike them. However, institutions we actually have no chance of electing, we trust them. The Queen, for example, in Britain, never elected, much trusted. Long-term dictators in this country, Marshal Tito, never elected, very much liked. I mean, in nostalgia and kind of these kind of images, yeah? And this brings me to the question of whether people actually do want to use their freedom and their rights. Do they care about making decisions? We live in we were taught in a democratic world that people do want to make decisions, and we even had in this country self-management. The main issue with self-management is how to avoid participating in decision-making. You have the right to elect your director in a factory. People were running away from the meeting. They said, this is boring. I don't want to participate in that. I don't want to take part in this. So I think, and this, to end with, it's easy to criticize populism and even demagoguery, which I think is a better word than populism. It's more clear, I think. But are we prepared to face with the negative and problematic side of democracy itself? That is a question. Because if we had a democracy in Croatia, we would never join the European Union. If there was a democracy in Germany and France on this issue, there would never been European Union integration. I'm pretty much sure that this was an elite project. And if you put it on the referendum, whether French think Germans are friends, in 1951, oh, hang on a minute, what would you get? We tried to do this in the United Kingdom, and look what happened. Look what happened. And now, well, we shot ourselves in the foot, probably, yeah. Okay, but that's a democratic decision. So I think it's a wider issue. It's not just populism. It is also, I think we need to be aware that democracy has many problems. It's still probably better than any alternative, but we should not idealize it. Otherwise, we are producing fake news.
Okay, thank you. Balázs, you want to comment something?
2 points on this. I think the issue here, I mean, like, who can declare what fake news is? Exactly. Like, who I am to say this is fake news or not? And I think that this is actually, it boils down to 2 factors. One is credibility, and the second is integrity. Well, credibility, does Trump has credibility? As it was explained, yes, in a certain audience, absolutely, right? And I'm afraid that the more we're gonna react in a way of, oh, Zeman is using fake news and all this, the Czech president, the more we're gonna put them into a certain victim situation, which actually helps them with their own audience, right? Trump, since out of 365 daily media of the United States, 364 openly declared support for Hillary Clinton. They openly campaigning, delegitimizing Trump, Where is their credibility to do that after? It's nobody asking these questions, but they are the ones who are pushing the fake news. And I think Trump is deliberately fighting the fake news war with them. It's an information warfare, actually gaining credibility with their own audience. I got 2 more examples of this. The Russians relying on Crimea and the next Crimea, right? Absolutely true. And this is not something the West doesn't let the Russia to go with it. But what really could cause the annexation of Crimea is the collapse of the central authority in Ukraine after Maidan. That was the major factor which allowed Russia to do the annexation, right? So you have a certain feeling that the Ukrainians are actually, reacting on that, and pretty much everything with blaming Russia on a number of issues, because they not want to take responsibility for that. And number 3, again, who has the credibility and the integrity in these issues? And number 3, we often labeling Belarus Lukashenko as the last dictatorship of Europe, which often leads toward a distorted understanding, about the country, because there's no democracy, right, in Belarus, but Lukashenko's regime has the credibility in the country. It has the social contract, which actually still works, and most of the Belarusians want it, despite of no democracy. And to understand that is the responsibility of A, the analyst, and B, the media, and unfortunately, this is not what you see when you're reading articles about Belarus. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think now it's the time to turn to the auditorium. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise up your hands. I mean, even though we are not arbiters of truth, we'll try to, or the panelists try to answer your questions. I've seen a lady over there and a man over there, so please, ladies first, maybe? Or, okay. Yes, please, ladies first.
Hi, my name is Milica Šarić. I work for Center for Investigative Journalism of Serbia. We do fact-checking in TINS, and so I actually would like some answers. First of all, just to add that there is, I can say that, consequences of fake news in media. They don't trust us anymore. So when I call somebody for an interview, they tell me, oh, I don't like media. And they don't know that we do fact-checking. So that there are consequences for others, for us, who do their job as well as we can. So that's one thing. But the answer I wanted is, what can we change? If it's about media management, if they cannot struggle, or they can struggle, is there something that inside every media can be done? Or because some of you are professors, is there any possibility of putting it in faculties, like to do something about fake news, about fact-checking, about, well, I don't know, ethics in media on your faculties? Maybe that is the change, starting from students and then going forward to media. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Tom Countryman from Washington. All of the self-criticism about the United States, European countries, Balkan countries from this panel is very well deserved. Very few words about a country that in this century has been both the pioneer and the master of creating a fact-free political environment, and is the only country that I see, as has been documented, actively exporting fake news to other countries in order to influence politics, and that's the Russian Federation. Is there something worth saying on this?
Thank you. Anyone else who wants to? Okay, a lady over there.
Hi, my name is Donna Costurano. I come from Youth Educational Forum Macedonia, and I have two-level question. Really intrigued by the discussion. The first thing is something the ambassador said. Civil society is one of the pillars of resilience. But what do we do when the post-truth is so skewed that civil society can be just very easily twisted into something that is a genuine citizen effort to something that is a foreign agent installment trying to deconstruct the democracy in a country, something we really easily see becoming the new truth in Hungary, in Turkey, in Macedonia, in a few other countries also. How do we combat this, and whose role is it in a damaged, segregated civil society under vicious attack by governments creating a new reality about the role of citizens in their country to preserve it? And a second point going into this is we have citizens that are resignated, that are divided, that are disconnected and do not feel an ownership towards their own states. And ideally, to have a society where we wouldn't have to have a discussion about post-truth, we would have journalists and media that can scrutinize every government and are competent and capable to self-regulate. And secondly, we will have citizens that live in integrated society, trusting each other, valuing and cherishing truth and argumentation, and having capacity to participate and hold governments accountable. But one of the very basic preconditions to reach this point is to have basic economic stability. And that is something nor citizens nor journalists, particularly in the Western Balkans, have. And we're quite far from having that sense of just basic human stability to pursue the other values that are more relevant in terms of a larger social scale. So how do we approach these two things?
Thank you. I think it's enough for now. So, I mean, can you approach these three questions? Anyone from the panel, please? Yeah?
If I could just touch on two of those questions. One was, when you mentioned civil society, just a correction to what I was trying to say, or maybe an elaboration. When I speak of civil society and the resilience of civil society, I don't mean it simply coterminous with nonprofits or with the third sector. I refer to civil society as business. I refer to civil society as even elements of quasi-official organizations like universities. And so there is an attack on some elements, visible elements of civil society in the more authoritarian governments, but it's the good news about civil society is it's bigger than that. And if the civil society organizations, and I don't know how this happens, if they are able to articulate a common goal of defending certain principles of behavior, they can be very strong. So my point was not to say there is a beleaguered group of nonprofits who are being ripped off by authoritarians, but rather to talk about the breadth of civil society, and that's where my optimism comes. On the question of Russia, I think that, personally, there may have been an assumption here that we're talking about, let's call it the Euro-Atlantic space, and the aspirants to that Euro-Atlantic space. And I'm of the opinion that Russia has chosen not to want to be part of the Euro-Atlantic space anymore. That for whatever reason, whether it's the events of 2005, 2007, the color revolutions, whether it's the watching the West trip itself in the recession, whatever reason, the legitimacy that might have tempted various powerful people in Russia to be part of the West seems to me to have dissipated. So in that sense, the reason I think they're not here, and I don't mean to say this in too blunt a way, is because they're not struggling There are Russians who are struggling with this in Russia, clearly, but that the Russian government does not seem to be struggling with these issues the way that the West is.
If I may just follow up on that. Well, thank you for that question, because I think we should have brought that also in the panel when we discussed the Western Balkans at least, but also Eastern European countries. Yes, I think Russia is present with propaganda. We did not use this word. This is part of fake news also, or semi-fake news, whatever, however we want to see that. So there is an increased interest and influence of Russia in the region through using, exploiting the vacuum of power, I'll say, and also the weak rule of law in the country, and using hybrid tools such as propaganda, media, but also corruption through, economic, through corrupted agents. So I think we're seeing a larger presence. There are, there have been examples such as in Montenegro and Macedonia that we have noticed that. But I think the raised interest of Russia in the region is part of a bigger geopolitical game that Russia has. And I think Western European countries, Euro-Atlantic partners, I think have to pay more attention of, how Russia is engaging in the region as an opportunistic spoiler, I'll say. And there was a question regarding investigative journalism, and this is a great point. I think, one of the, main sources of the bottom-up pressure, especially in the Western Balkans, is investigative journalism that are shedding light and bringing into light a lot of issues and challenges that we're facing. But then on the other side is job security, human security. So if the journalists might want to be open and express their own opinion, but they are controlled. They are economically and politically controlled. So this is the biggest issue, at least in the region of the Western Balkans, where media kind of depends on the government for their daily business. And as a solution, the European Union is talking so much about resiliency. Well, in the EU global strategy, resiliency is mentioned, either resilient or resiliency, it's mentioned more than 40 times, and that's the buzzword in the European Union. And talking about individual resiliency, which is human and economic and social, but also state resiliency and societal resiliency. Now, there is a gap, I would say, in many countries, especially transitioning countries that have democratic dysfunctions, between societal resiliency and state resiliency when there is no trust in the state. So how can you build that up? How can you decrease the gap between state and society? And this is, I would say, one of the biggest issues that needs to be addressed. And we're talking about the Euro-Atlantic community. I think, and this is personal, maybe I'm not good in this topic, but I think this is a phase that will disappear. But here in the region is very dangerous because you have a democratic dysfunctionality, and this might turn up into much bigger security challenges. That's why we need to pay much more attention in what's happening in the transition countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah.
About Russia. We have not touched the subject because I think the debate was very much about what's happening within the Euro-Atlantic space and our democracies. But you are right to raise the question because they've always been very good at disinformation during all the Cold War, and it's one of the specialties that they keep certainly using, and especially as they have they've chosen their own course, they have their own objectives. We should not be surprised that they use all the tools at their disposal to pursue their objectives. And of course they have understood, and probably understood even before others, the power of the social media and how you can use these to pursue your objectives. So that's it's been used in different contexts, but it's much more complex and sophisticated than just fake news. I think it's very much about relativation of truth, taking some facts, sometimes some facts which are perfectly true and verified, and using them, presenting the facts in a perfectly legitimate manner, but then you have the comments and the interpretation of the facts, and it's always with an idea in the back of the mind, which is very often to undermine the credibility of Western institutions. And they are not the only one doing that, certainly, but if you look at RT, which is their main tool in this project, they run very interesting stories that you will not see on Western medias, and which are sometimes fascinating, but it's always interesting to see how it ends and what the conclusions, what the presentators are making as conclusions. This is where it becomes very sophisticated.
Okay. Yeah, Balázs, just a short comment, and I would like to get a second round of the questions from the auditorium.
Very shortly, first on the media, I think my personal experience, and I'm not sure I didn't run any research, there are way too much advocacy in the media these days or these years, and much less reporting. And part of this is obviously has economic background. The funding for media, the journalist salaries, the job description has changed. Who is going to be the first matter most, whether what they publish actually is accurate. So there is, so this kind of, like how much obviously the internet and how much the media has been as a traditional institution has changed, and how much the funding or the economy of the media has changed, obviously has going to be, or already has a large repercussion on that, which I think should be researched more. Second, on Russia's role, I'm researching Russia, and actually, I was persona non grata at some point in Russia, coming in a dissident family in Czechoslovakia, and knowing that Russia doesn't even control Transnistria in its neighborhood, I found vastly exaggerated Russia's role in all these credibility issues, what we have at home. I'm not saying that we shouldn't take it, particularly because of Ukraine, right? This is really where the Russia power actually was showing, soft, hybrid, and real power. But let me ask you, because the Western media is writing about that a lot, that Putin is winning the chess game with the West, If you're winning the chess game, why you would get the gun out? Putin didn't win any chess game in Crimea. They actually reacted by force because they felt that this is the only thing they can do or they have to do to protect their biggest national interest, which is a Black Sea Treaty. Now, the Russian soft power, if you take a look, the media, the church, the state institutions, including state businesses, only matter when there are Russian speakers. How many Russian speakers are in the United States or anywhere else? Russia today, the Western media coverage is providing much, much more influence for the Russian propaganda, because there is Russian propaganda and misinformation. Unfortunate, because it's earned media. The West is keep talking about Russia's influence. Putin always wins. Where? Not in Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Transnistria, and all these places. Then how come that Putin always wins in the West? So I think I don't find it's helpful. I think it should be a much more healthier debate about Russia's role, real and perceived role. But give you another fact. The Gazprom in the past 5 years lost every case against the European Union and does anything what the EU wants from it. Why? Because they actually having a diminishing market share, right? And then I want to lose it. So, and they don't behave like a bully, partly because the Europeans also learning the game, and actually there's much more sophisticated when it comes. So the media reaction, which I think partly coming because of the Russia's American role, and it needs to be kind of passed, I think, or fixed in a way that it's realistic and not perceived.
Okay, thank you. So let's get back to the auditorium so they have a chance to have a second round of questions. So please, if you have a question, please raise up your hand. I've seen a gentleman over there and a gentleman over here.
All right, Cosmin Anița from University of Bucharest and New Strategy Center. Well, as a historian, I can say that all these things, they've been in place for, a lot of, more than 100 years. So, but I wouldn't come to comments. I would disagree with you in underestimating Russia, given the fact that this is what I'm studying. I'm not in the side that we should overestimate Russia, which is true, but underestimating doesn't really help, doesn't it? But I would actually bring in a question that I've been listening from my students all over. Given the role of technology now, that everything's available at any time, anywhere, and the fact that you have a lot of channels that show you that something else is fake news, and you find something that about the first channel that is fake news. So nobody actually knows what is fake news and what has been stemmed as a fake news. So at the end of the day, they ask me, what should I read? So where is it that you find things that are not fake news? Because everyone pretends that finds the fake news. So where is the, to whomever wants to answer this, it might be helpful.
Thank you. Question over here.
Shpatim Gashi from the Council for Inclusive Governance. And the focus tonight was here on the fake news and manipulation of facts. But we also have a lot of real news which is easily accessible. But my question is, do you think the fake news nowadays affects only a small portion of the population? Or has it become so powerful that it might determine the outcome of an election? And I mean in countries of democracies, not Russia.
Okay, thank you. And one more question. It will be probably the last question. Okay, the last question of today.
Hi, thank you all for coming. My question is about something that sounds a bit boring. I'm sorry, my name is Mladen Mrdalj. I'm with the Brazidis consultancy. The question is a bit about a topic that might be boring, but I think it's very, very important. Nobody likes to talk about electoral system as a way to fight fake news, because fake news flourish where there is a big distance between the voter and the political sphere. In Serbian electoral system, we have people voting for parties, for leaders, and they have no idea who sits in the parliament. If we were to reduce electoral systems so that it would encompass small electoral districts, their politicians would have been closer to them. They would be much easier to approach for what is fact, what is not. They would be more credible. But it seems that nobody likes to talk about the electoral system because it's not sexy. It's not something that is in a lingo today. It's something that boring professors do in law schools. I would like someone to comment on electoral system as a possible way to bring politics down and thus make it more credible. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So anyone of the panelists want to answer the questions?
I would just address that last one with a comment, which is I think you're right in focusing not so much on electoral reform, but I think one of the things that people who care about responsibility and legitimacy can focus on is what local politics, municipal politics, politics that follows the subsidiarity principle and brings it closer to people, so that what we may find, it's only an indirect answer to your question, is that legitimacy of elected officials may increase the smaller the constituency. And so that it may be that that is one of the forces for common sense, accepting facts as they are, and that may be part of the answer to the crisis of legitimacy that people have. Not changing the big system, but paying attention to the local system. I'll stop there.
I'll just say that in the case of the Western Balkans, this is an issue that comes, every time reform of the electoral system, and I think this is also part of the strategic manipulation that politicians do. Not blatant in the elections day, because now the international community and there are new rules of the game, but they do that through the rules of the electoral system. And another point which is very important, I think, that needs to be addressed is by focusing on electoral reform, I think we're also focusing on fighting against corruption, because one of the main drivers of corruption, not only in the region but worldwide, is political parties financing. And this is where we have the least transparency also when it comes to the region. And there are so many vested interests from all sides of politics that they do not want to touch that issue. So you're perfectly right. Starting reforms, I think, needs to start by the electoral reforms.
I think what we need to do also is to abolish or abandon, in fact, the idea of that is expressed, I think, best in this "there is no alternative" floskula, or the slogan, right, should I say. I mean, for the last 25 years, in a political and much of the media and intellectual elites have been actually arguing that there is only one game in town, this is European Union, and that therefore there is no alternative, and that it's only a matter of time, and it looks like driving a bob, this winter game. Like you have only one direction, there is no turning left and right, it's only a matter of time. And if you are skillful enough and you don't really do a major mistake, either on checks or on not pushing your head a bit down as it's required and not having pushed at the beginning enough, you will eventually come there to that one place, which is called the European Union, which is a construction, which is an image, which is an ideal place, right? It's the end of transition. It's the moment when you are recognized as a normal country and no longer a country that needs to be told what to do. It's a recognition that you are just European in a way, right? I mean this is not fake news, but it's certainly producing a situation in which a lot of people actually are looking for alternatives. They're saying, well, look, we are fed up with this. We were told, in fact, in 1989 that there was freedom coming, and now you are telling us there was no alternative but only one way. This is irreconcilable. You can't have freedom and no alternative situation. And I think much of the popularity of Russia comes from there. It is actually the image of something else, something that is not that one and the same story, and in a search for an alternative. And actually, the more Eurosceptic some other countries are becoming, the more this image of Putin or Erdogan, where applicable, is growing. I mean, look at public opinion in Greece, in which when you ask population who is the best friend of your country, they would say Russia and Serbia. And who is the main enemy? Turkey and Germany. I mean, Turkey and Germany are allies in NATO. Russia and Serbia are not. But that's the point. The point is that political elite has actually taken the country in the only one direction, and we actually want something else, basically in the image. Whether this is really true or fake, I mean, I think this is the image of Putin that people are building in their heads. They would not like to live in a system that looks like Putin. I mean, they don't go to Moscow or to Russia for working. They don't really speak Russian in Serbia. Yeah? There is no popularity for that. And if you look reality, I mean, the Prime Minister in the morning said, these are facts and this is perception. Do you remember that? The fact is that this country is going into European Union. It has I don't know how many exercises with America and only 2 with Russia. This is the fact. And the fact is, for example, what Dmitry Bechev writes in his book, Rival Power, in which he actually explains how little is in reality Russia present here in economic terms, in political terms, in security, and so on and so forth. And Turkey as well. Of all Turkish export, it's only 1.32% to the Balkans. And yet there is this big image in Bosnia-Herzegovina that Erdogan is building everything, that he is the savior, he is the model. In reality is that it is much more European Union and European partners present than the others. But I think we are producing this image without even doing much, really. I mean, whatever he does, it is money not well spent. Because we have been producing this idea that there is no alternative but only one way. And I think for as long as we perpetrate this narrative, there will be a search for alternative as a search for freedom, in a way. You can't have freedom without an alternative, right?
Okay, can we get back to the last 2 questions so we can answer them? Anyone from yeah.
On the elections, I have an example from Moldova. I mean, I generally agree, but there is no universal recipe for that. And here's an example from Moldova, which has just changed the election system for 50-50. 50 would come from a party list and 50 single districts out of the 100. You know why they did that? Because the incumbent party, which is incredibly unpopular, but captured the state, has the money to buy those votes. So unless, the actual thing that, that's one thing what you mentioned about the voter and the politician. But the other thing is the capture. The state or the policy capture what we have been seeing as much in the East, as much in the West as well. And that's the conflict of interest which needs to be addressed. And point number 2, I also do believe that, unfortunately, I already mentioned, we do help Russia image, meaning how influential Russia is in our regions a lot without actually, getting into the into the bottom or the facts. Just one, how influential Russia's soft power is. The number of Estonians who reclaimed Russian citizenship, around 30% of Estonia's population is Russian. So in the past 25 years, there's 56 Estonians ask for Russian citizenship. That's the influence of the Russian soft power in the Baltic countries, really. And number three, I wish everyone, I'm a Hungarian from Slovakia who's working for an American think tank, mostly covering Eastern Europe, right? Could be the perfect example of the globalization. But I also have my parents living in Slovakia in a Hungarian community with 25,000 people. And I have these conversations with my friends. And I know the dissatisfaction and all this why. I really wish for everyone, particularly for this kind of conferences, much more common sense and much less echo chambers and polarized debates. But much more common sense is what is missing in the media as well as in addressing these kind of issues.
Okay, thank you. I mean, anyone else who wants to answer these two questions somehow? I mean, is there a truth? I mean, what shall we give to students to read? Is there really a truth somewhere?
My only thing is to go back to you as the professor, that you represent a civil society institution, and the wonderful thing about your role is you get to choose. You say, where should I look? You're an educated person, and the students trust you. You're the one, when you say, who should I ask? You're the one I'd ask. So I just see that as the role of the person who is the responsible individual at a university.
Okay, thank you. I'm not really sure whether we've answered your question. That's fine. Okay. So I think I would like to thank all of the panelists and all of the brilliant auditorium for today's session, and see you tomorrow.